Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and dear audience. On behalf of Conflict and Resilience Research Institute and Rotary Club of Winnipeg Peace Builder Committee, let me have the privilege to welcome you in the first of series of Winnipeg Anti-Racism Week webinars, and this is series 1 today. Our theme is Messy Conversation, Enforcement, Engagement, and Emancipation in Policing in Minnesota, United States of America. We have a steamed pool of panelists today to enlighten us about this issue. Before we begin, traditionally, we do treaty recognition. The Conflict and Resilience Research Institute Canada is based on original lands of Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and on the homeland of Métis Nation. We respect the treaties that were made on these territories. We acknowledge the harms and mistakes of the past, and we dedicate ourselves to move forward in partnership with Indigenous communities in a spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. Ladies and gentlemen, as I promised, let me introduce and hand over the floor to Dr. Raj, and he's going to moderate today's session. Dr. Raj, sir, floor is yours.
Well, thank you. Thank you for inviting us. I'm not sure if I'm the best moderator. I don't do moderation, but I want to appreciate how you started this meeting, this gathering today with the treaty acknowledgement. We, in our own traditions in the U.S., do a similar, right, a process. So I want to also do a land and enslavement acknowledgement statement, right, at this point. So if I could invite whoever is watching this to gently lower your gaze and focus on your breath as I read this poem that does both the land and enslavement acknowledgement. So as you breathe in and breathe out, I want to read A Vision for Justice by Michelle Amster. And she says in this poem, long, long time ago, or was it last year? Or was it yesterday? A seed was planted. A justice tree seed was planted. But how will it grow? This justice tree, how will it grow when the ground is poisoned with lies and broken treaties? How will it grow when the water spills the blood of African and indigenous bodies? How will it grow when the stories of settlers is the sun that scorches the backs of the earth and the community of Black and indigenous members and drinks their tears? And when we know that our stories are not the same. And we know that justice is intended to be a verb. And we know that it is all about the babies, taking care of the babies until the 7 generations. The babies we must love in ourselves, in our homes, in our communities, and in our streets. Yes, in our streets. Bearing witness, creating brave spaces and safe spaces. Learning from the past to see the future. They say Sankofa. Telling our stories, and then, maybe then, this moment becomes a movement. So as you listen to this poem and bring your gaze back to the screen and to the voices of the panelists here, and I want to appreciate this opportunity to talk from a space that has experienced tremendous amount of pain, right? and promise it all at the same time, right? We are sitting and standing in the space where a man was lynched on May 25th, 2020. So as you come back, I want to invite you to stay in the space, in your heart space, right? Open your eyes and stay in your heart space as we begin this conversation, right? And Michelle Amster beautifully points out that, right, we have been affected as a country, right, for the past 400, 500 years by colonization. And the impacts and the footprints of colonization still continues around the world, right? Olua Taiwo, who's an environmentalist, often talks about the idea that colonization, right, about 10 countries pretty much owned, possessed the rest of the world for over 500 years, right? I want to invite us to think about the impact of that colonization, how settlers colonized the minds, the lands, the resources, the hearts of communities all around the world, right? Not until 1945, 1950, 60, 70 that we saw that the number of distinct countries and cultures and communities and language began to populate the United Nations as we know it, right? That's the impact of what we saw in the streets of Minneapolis, 38 in Chicago on May 25th, 2020, right? Which also happened to be almost to the date of 100 years ago in the streets of Duluth. 3 young men, young Black men, were lynched on the words of a white woman, right? That happened about 100 years ago before this latest form of lynching. So when we talk about, right, enforcement, I'm often invited to think about the history of enforcement, right? And we often think about, our history of colonization and civilization. But no, let's think about the history of enforcement. Over hundreds of years of just enforcing certain rules, certain ways of being, certain language, certain idiosyncrasies, right, that are introduced to us by whiteness and white supremacist ideologies were populated around the world, right? And consistently in this hemisphere, in this space, right, what the native people refer to as the Turtle Island, right? How it consumed everything. So even what sociologists and race theorists often say is that we are introduced to democracy as an experiment, right? In a classic lab, an experiment will include a control group and an experimental group. So imagine you sitting in that seat, looking at a control group and an experimental group, right? And if science bears it, we know that the experimental group is going to be saddled with and given all the wherewithals to succeed for that experiment to see if it works. And the control group is not. In a classic sense, that's what happened here. The way we introduced democracy in this space, right, was to give all of the wherewithals for the white population to grow, right? They were given land, right? And we created universities, right? University of Minnesota, right? AKA a land grabbing university, right? That was given and built to help the farmers all around the state of Minnesota. And you'll see that land grabbing universities in Texas, in Iowa, any state, right? So the advantage that was given, all built to today, when that lynching happened and that normalization of the killing of a black body and the killing of native indigenous communities that led to the creation of AIM, American Indian Movement, right? Right here in Minnesota, in the streets of Lake Street, Lake Street, right? It was started there because the indigenous population often was harmed by police action. And we saw the birth of the Black Panther movement, and we saw the birth of Black Lives Matter movement, all about understanding the brutality and the harm that has been perpetrated and perpetuated by whiteness, right? So when we think about enforcement, right, let's think about a history of enforcement and the creation of institutions to over the years to continue the enforcement in a more rational, right, normal way. We have social services that is an enforcement agency. We have law enforcement that is an enforcement agency, right? Name it. Even in our schools, we suspend and get students out of there, right? Because we enter into an enforcement mentality even in our schools. Housing is an enforcement agency. So on and so forth. So when we think about enforcement, let's not just narrow that to policing. Policing is part of the culture that enforces a systemic way of being, right? A system that is built on white privilege and whiteness in this country. So I wanna stop at this point and invite Regina and then Deandre and Louisa to share their perspectives as we go in this category of enforcement, right? And end up in emancipation. Regina?
Thank you, Raj. What you just said was so profound and so thought-provoking. It's going to take me a minute to really catch up and do some justice to some of the points that you were making. One thing that came to mind was when you were talking about control group and experimental group, and how the experimental group is given everything it needs to succeed and the control group is not. And when you said that, I thought, well, it's the controlled group. And when I think about, and I'm an educator, and I'm also here representing the Southeast Minnesota Synod of the ELCA Community Accompaniment Table. And we are a mission table that supports people walking alongside other people in their journey. So with conflict resolution and my community accompaniment table work, it's justice in action. I'm also the director of research, curriculum, and professional development for Equity Alliance Minnesota. And so my day-to-day work focuses on helping school leaders disrupt oppressive schooling practices, right? I focus on racial equity and educational equity. And so in a very brief period of time, I've kind of just shared, like, this is my life's work on so many fronts, right? Civic, religious, and within education. Going back to controlled group or control group and experimental group, when I think about the students that go through our school system, the institutional practices that have been normed and the cultural practices that reinforce them do not allow our Black and Brown and Indigenous students equal access and equal opportunity. And we see this in the disproportionalities in discipline. And Raj, you had touched on suspensions, but daily discipline referrals, who's getting sent to the office and who's not, and for what reasons. And we have allowed many of our Black, Brown, and Indigenous children to fall through the cracks in our education system simply because they've made a teacher feel uncomfortable, and the discomfort oftentimes didn't result from the child doing anything horrible, but maybe speaking a little too loudly, or maybe asking a question, right? So what, insubordination, right? Subjective discipline reasons. We've got a history of that. Fortunate, many of our school districts are revising their policies and practices and not allowing students to be sent to the office or suspended on subjective reasons. The other thing is, we don't think about cultural norming and race and intelligence, right? We don't think about our Black, Brown, and Indigenous ways that reflect their beauty and their resilience and their excellence. So if our Black, Brown, and Indigenous children had these same resources and opportunities as our white students in our schools, we would not have an under-enrollment of Black, Brown, and Indigenous children in gifted programming. We would have different ways of norming giftedness as well, right? Historically, that type of programming has protected privilege. We have an overabundance, and I don't know if that's the right word. I'll go back to disproportionality. We have a disproportionate number of Black, Brown, and Indigenous boys in special education. And so when students are removed from the mainstream educational environment, they are missing out on learning that the other students get. And so, you know, in the worst cases, our children are being managed, right? They're being managed and pushed through a system and then left to figure things out on their own. With the right kinds of interventions and with leadership that can understand a lot of the systemic pieces that Raj started off with, we can have school leaders that disrupt those oppressive schooling practices. Now, that's a big part of my work. My day-to-day work, my 9-to-5 work, is supporting the disrupting of those oppressive schooling practices through curriculum, through policy, through behavior, through awareness. It's a big job because we are up against a culture that has normed anti-Blackness, that has normed viewing Black, Brown, and Indigenous children through a deficit lens. And I also want to add Asian children. We are consistently dehumanized, or when we are humanized, it's conditional. And a lot of our students, when we survey our students in our schools, they talk about not feeling a sense of belonging. And I imagine what they're learning is what I learned in my own schooling experience, was that my sense of belonging was conditional. So it wasn't about me going into a space and being able to be myself. It was, I was allowed in this space and I'm able to remain in that space if I behave. So policing is just the next, for me and the work I do, policing is just the next level for when the kids leave the system. But Raj, control group and experimental group, that really helps to frame the differential treatment and the different experiences that our white students often have and our Black, Brown, Indigenous, and Asian students often have in our system. So I forgot, was I supposed to talk more about me? Because I'm not really that interested in me. No. Like, yeah, I'm so into the work. I'm like, let's just get into it.
Yeah, we could go into, we can pass it on to Deandre. Thank you, Regina. Appreciate it. If you're watching, give it up for Regina. Okay.
Thank you, Dr. Raj and Regina. My name is Deandre Gordon, and I'm here as a board member of Conflict Resolution Minnesota. And I want to thank Dr. Ahmed and CRRIC for allowing me to share this space with you all today. So I want to start by sharing a personal story of myself. It's the first time that I've shared it publicly. When I was about 12 years old, I was still living in Jamaica. The Jamaica Defense Forces and the Jamaica Constabulary Forces, soldiers and police, executed a joint operation in my family home. I considered it a raid. During that raid, they only told us that they were looking for illegal weapons and illegal drugs. I grew up in a predominantly woman household, and so the security forces roughed up the women in my household verbally, and at the end of their raid, to no avail. Of course, they didn't find anything. They simply told us that it was the wrong residence. There was no recourse after that, and I want to tie that to a larger systemic thing, because I think of the quote: "The problem is not police; the problem is policing itself." And I think it's important to make a distinction there, because policing doesn't necessarily mean soldiers and police. It's much like Rod said. It's in our social services. It's in our housing. It's in our school. So between 1980 and 2020 in Jamaica, a total of 7,372 people were killed by security forces. Many of them were inner city young black males, some women, and the highest was 357 in 2010, the lowest 85 in 2019. Now, part of the reason why there is such a large decrease is because of the way how police are held accountable. So in Jamaica, there is a state agency, a government agency, if you will, known as the Independent Commission of Investigations. There is a law called the Indicum Act, which allows Indicum has interpreted the powers laid out in the act as their powers are to investigate, prosecute, and convict officers accused of misconduct and wrongdoing. Of course, law enforcement agencies across the country are not. They have been increasingly resistant to the powers of Indicum insofar that they have challenged the commission and the courts and said their powers are not to convict and prosecute or necessarily investigate. It got to the Privy Council, which is the final court, and last year the final court ruled that they don't have those powers. And I think that's really important as we think about how much power we give the state, because I think for many people, including myself, I don't necessarily feel safe around law enforcement. And for a significant subsection of the population to not feel safe, safety is an inherent human need. I think we need to rethink our conception of justice. What is justice? And how is it being applied? Does it aim to restore or to punish? Right now, our systems very much lean on the side of punishing, and sometimes we leave measures of accountability up to the state. But as we've seen with the murder, I would go so far as saying an assassination of George Floyd and many other Black men, Black women, increasingly other people of color. The state is not necessarily working for when it comes to accountability, even though there are measures in place. And so we need to rethink the social contract that we have with the state, and how that impacts the most vulnerable individuals that we have like in our society that have been marginalized. Because though like I live in Minnesota now, and Jamaica received independence, gained independence from the British monarchy in 1962. The government of Jamaica still maintains a lot of those like colonial practices, and so there's not like an ethic of care as it pertains to people who are vulnerable, and those are the people who tend to slip through the cracks. We don't ever consider like how poverty might create like the conditions that lead to crime, or what's happening like within families, and how kind of support our response is automatically always to how do we like punish, like who needs to get held accountable. So that's another thing I would invite us to consider as we move through this conversation today, is what does accountability look like, and what can it look like? Because we have a tendency to revert back to what we already know, when we find it difficult to rethink something or to reimagine what public safety looks like. Because public safety is housing, public safety, is providing social services. Public safety are all the things that are currently under-resourced. And I just want to close my point by saying that exclusion, in my view, is the heart of like all conflict. And so when various marginalized groups are excluded, then it's inevitable that like conflict will arise, because people don't necessarily feel like a sense of empowerment, like they're part of the society, like they're part of like a democracy, which is what we aim to have. So thank you, Regina and Raj. I'm really looking forward to continuing like this conversation as we move through. But those are some of the questions that I want to leave us with, and tying that to my experience.
Thank you all. If you're listening, big applause to Deandre. And let's we want to invite Louisa to share her thoughts.
Thank you, Raj, Deandre, Regina, Gary, Dr. Causa. Here I am as a woman who doesn't look like my fellow colleagues, compatriots. Why am I here? What does justice look like to me? What does justice look like to you? What is your story? What is my story? What is the story? And I've been sitting here thinking, what can I contribute? I'm an accomplice, marching alongside with. Yet what is my story? And how can I bring the story of me into the conversation? I've lived in the United States 35 years. That's longer than I've lived in the UK. I came to the United Kingdom, from the United Kingdom to the US when I was 21 years old. What did policing look like when I grew up as a kid? Community-based, bobbies, which are police officers walking down the streets with truncheons, not guns, with these funny hats, the men at least. I always wondered what would happen if they had to run down the street. They usually did. Those hats fell off. And the women had a different outfit, so to speak. But the thing was, we were in conversation and relationship with police officers in our community, wherever we went. And the biggest difference was they were not tote carriers, gun carriers. Turn the clock forward, September 11th, 2001. Things began to change. I remember a story and a conversation I had with my beloved mother, who passed away this last May, but I used to visit her a lot. And we would get into all kinds of conversations, usually on double-decker buses. And one of the conversations I had sitting on the top level of the double-decker bus, I'll never forget it. was how I had noticed that law enforcement in the UK were beginning to carry guns. And I thought that was really strange. Yes, I recognized it in the airport. But on the streets of London, asking for directions, I'm now seeing somebody with a sawn-off shotgun. My mother was very defensive. So much so that her voice elevated and the guy behind on the bus started having a conversation with her about how I should go back to the United States where I came from. Confusing to me, since my beloved home was the UK, but it made me start thinking about what law enforcement looked like in the United States. And the fact that when I did come back to England, it was a scary experience, different from the last time. It reminded me also of a woman who's white, who shouldn't live in fear. If you listen to our friends today who do live in fear, or the disparities, the power imbalance, story upon story upon story, that I indeed am scared of law enforcement in the United States. Every time I drive down the street and I see a police officer in his or her squad car come up behind me, I think I'm going to be pulled over. I did something wrong. So what would it feel like to be a person that doesn't look like me? There's one final story I want to share, and this is to kind of agitate us and get us thinking a little more, because we're going to come back to Dr. Raj. A story a number of years ago in Richfield, Minnesota. I had returned some tools to a friend in Richfield, Minnesota. It was an autumnal night. There were leaves crackling a little bit under my shoes, and I got into this thing where I didn't know where to leave these tools. And my friend was expecting me, but she had had surgery, and she forgot I was coming. Long story short, I spent too long in the driveway. It was getting dark. I got back into my car, and all of a sudden I see these lights, but no people, but this light, like a flashlight. And all of a sudden I was surrounded by police. True story. I was freaking out. The police officer that came up to the side of my car window where I was asked me for identification. I was shit scared. More so when I started digging around in my bag looking for my ID. I'm still alive to tell the story. What would have happened if I didn't look like me? Would I be here to tell the story? Would it be that I was looking for a weapon to turn it on law enforcement? Food for thought. Conversation to be had later, perhaps when I get invited in. No preparation. These came to me as I'm thinking, what can I share? And it was off of the backs of my friends that kind of set the stage. So hopefully this made sense. But Dr. Raj, I'm going to pass it back to you.
No, appreciate, and there was a gentle nudge and a request for us to introduce ourselves. So I hope whenever we get an opportunity, I know Regina did a better job than the rest of us. So I apologize, Doc, and to CRRIC for the way we're jumping in. I say that because I, as a faculty member in the School of Law Enforcement Criminal Justice at a state university in Minnesota, often have wrestled with this idea of what are we really teaching our students, right? So in those reflections and in those questions, I come to realize that whatever we have taught and continue to teach in our academic world has also lent itself in this perpetuation and continuation of a racialized process when it comes to enforcement, right? We often teach theories. We often rely on research, right? We often rely on metrics and ethics and so on and so forth, right? Where we dehumanize, we remove the humanity from the process. So I have always said, as a recovering criminologist, right, I've come to see more about how we can humanize the world that we are functioning in, right? What environmentalists often reference to, right? We live not in lanes, but we are a part of a larger concentric process, right? Everything around us, the earth, the tree, right, nature, and other human beings are all kins. And if we understand that we are kins, then we are able to see each other's humanity. But when we teach and practice and train people to dehumanize, remove their humanity, and objectify people, then enforcement becomes the part and parcel of a culture, not engagement, right? Engagement falls aside because I don't need to engage with you because you are an object, right? That ideology of enslavement began by one's ability to objectify and put a price tag on another human being, right? So look at how thick this process is, how ingrained this process of enforcement is, and it disenfranchises those who want to engage the community, those who want to humanize the process. So as a faculty member, I apologize on a consistent basis and continue to and will, right, to my community because we have failed. We have failed in this process. We can publish and gather up data, right, and create all kinds of algorithms to explain why crime exists. But when Dr. King said, those who are disenfranchised as a result of racism, as a result of poverty, marginalization, and militarization, if we do not get to the roots of their pain, right, that Deandre talked about, right, and help and begin the process of restoring their humanity, right, what Nelson Mandela often say, Ubuntu, to be able to see my humanity in you and you being able to see your humanity in me, it is impossible to engage, right? But we live in a society that often teaches us how to objectify, right? So when I apologize as a faculty member for failing to do that process of humanizing, right? And this continues on in every other field. We teach science without really understanding the humanity behind that process. So today, as COVID hits us, in a year, we have lost 500,000 plus people in the United States of America, and a disproportionate number of Black and brown bodies have died because we failed to humanize healthcare. Healthcare became an enforcement agency. You don't pay your bill, you can't walk into that hospital. If you can't pay your bill, we're going to hand your account to a collection agency that will continue to traumatize you on a daily basis, right? So over and over, we are taught not to engage in our community, right? We are taught to study our community, not engage, not humanize. So when Deandre said, right, how do we think about restoring our relationship? We don't start what is above the water. We have to start what is underneath the water. Let's go back to repair the harm of 400 years of enslavement, 500 years of genocide, right? If we don't do that, right, we will still continue in another 100 years, look back and say, what the hell did we do? Why is this continuing, right? And Louisa talked about Britain, right? And we are seeing the British police and attitude towards women and people of color, right? Who have moved into the spaces in London and in other places who are often criminalized. And a similar history is happening here and continues to happen here, right? We had 246 years of enslavement. And we have only been free of that enslavement for about 155 years. Let's not talk about democracy in the way that's like, oh my God, all is well. We have been in enslavement longer than we have been away from it. It will take another 91 plus years to match the number of years that we have been in enslavement. So we have that much more work to do, right? So how do we begin? And I'm going to begin this conversation with this and then pass it on. I want to appreciate what Deandre said, right? Inviting us to figure out how do we restore our relationships, repair the harm, right? So we can reform in accordance to the restoration and the reparative justice that we have done in the front end. And if we don't repair, we don't restore, reform is just what it is. It is putting a Band-Aid on the wound, right? If these three aspects, right, restoring and repairing and reforming is done in conjunction with one another at a deeper level, then we can talk about transforming our communities and our ways of being, right? So appreciate that. And I'm going to pass it on to Regina to share her thoughts. And then Deandre, I want to be mindful. We have about 12 minutes or so. And then we'll pass it on for ask for questions and answers. So thank you.
First, I would like to share that I am delighted to be on this panel and have been invited to be along for this ride, this journey. Being with Louisa and Deandre and Raj is amazing. Raj, these are really deep things to talk about in such a small period of time. Restore, repair, reform. You had said something that really caught my attention. You said that, and I'm assuming you're talking BIPOC folks, communities of color, that have been historically oppressed, that we have been conditioned to study each other, but not to be in community with one another. And I think that there is something really rich and incredibly valuable in deepening that thought. Because, and you know what it helps, it reminds me of? It reminds me of network television. And if you've ever watched those, well, I'm talking to you, Raj, you have a criminology background, so I feel kind of silly saying this, but you know, the shows like Judge Judy or The People's Court. And one often sees people that look like me in the audience, right? And so the audience is filled with people who are studying, who look like me, studying people who look like me, going through the criminal justice system. And that's an image that's repeated over and over and over again. Or if you think of that show that I don't think is on the air anymore called Cops, and you watch that show and it's image after image after image of Black men being arrested. And so if you watch that show as a Black person, then it's a Black person studying other Black people and not really being in community. And if you're saying, Raj, that in order for healing to happen, people have to be in community with one another, I would be interested to know from your perspective or Deandre's perspective or Louisa's perspective or anyone on the panel, what your vision is for that to be able to happen, keeping in mind that the systems and the structures do not encourage that, but quite the opposite, discourage it.
Thank you, Regina. Appreciate. Yeah, that's a good question. I want to invite Deandre.
Yeah, I just want to quickly add to that because like we're using this analogy of being like in community like with each other, and like all I could think about is how in many ways all of us were sort of like cogs like in this machine, like where like if we can get through ourselves through today, then we'll be fine, and we can't quite reach that like next level, that higher level of thinking. And a good example of that, like I see like a lot of liberation spaces that do work around liberation. They often focus like stripped down to like one or two issues because that's all they can handle, whether it's because of a capacity issues. Sometimes it's race, sometimes it's class, but too many spaces aren't like intersectional in nature, and like intersectionality focuses on those who have been historically excluded. And I think after like the uprising last year with after George Floyd's murder, we saw a lot of co-opting, and now a lot of that has like died. A lot of the work that had started, essentially like the passion around it has died off, and people have moved on to other things, almost like we're anticipating the next thing to happen. And so I think part of like doing this work also has to be rooted in like anti like imperialism, because for those of us who live in the US, when it's something happens to our neighbor, we can empathize that, we can feel it because it's something we see, we can live and breathe it. But when it happens overseas, for example, we don't even necessarily give it a second thought. Or for in using examples of like refugees that come to the US from elsewhere, or like drone strikes and things, we're sort of like, oh, like that thing happened, and it's like a passing thought like in our minds, but we never actually really think about how so much of it is wrapped up in like race and class and like colonial practices, because of how like the faces of oppression work. They sort of build off of each other, whether that's like cultural domination, exclusion, and other like ism. So I think start building community, we really have to just start with ourselves first and foremost, because we really have to. The first step is like awareness. Like, are you willing to take a step back and really examine like how you've navigated systems without any issue or very little issue at all? And while people with lighter skin might not necessarily fully understand like my experience or your experience or Raj's experience or anyone with dark skin, they can be accomplices in the sense where they are like allowing like people who have been excluded to really like lead and like follow their leadership, and not just ask them to lead but not necessarily crediting them or um paying them what they're worth, or just really recognizing people's work for what it is, and not adding to the burdens by asking for free labor. And so that's like one concrete way I think we can really build community.
Thank you, Deandre. Appreciate. Deandre, do you want to quickly tell us what do you do? Any kind of introduction that we need?
Yeah, so during my day job, I do public policy work for a mid-sized nonprofit here in St. Paul. A lot of our work is focused on like homelessness and emergency shelters, and we have a large social justice agenda. So it involves like mobilizing people and also like working with lawmakers to get bills passed that we believe will uplift the people that we serve, which are predominantly Black and Indigenous and people of color who come to us for emergency services and things. Because even in that space, there are disparities, like who gets access to services and who does not. And it's unfortunate because when someone shows up at a shelter, for example, they're there because it's sort of like the last straw for them, like they need help. And knowing that our white counterparts are better able to access that system for many reasons versus our Black and brown counterpart creates a lot of challenges. And so even in, like I said, in that space, there needs to be more work done around racial equity and class justice.
Thank you, brother. Louisa, do you want to quickly introduce yourself and then?
Yeah, I'll introduce myself and then a quick thought as I close up. So I am a family mediator and work as an independent provider here in the state of Minnesota. So I work with families who are experiencing conflict, and much of my work is high conflict as it relates to the challenges with minor children and what happens when families fall apart. So a lot of my time is really the bridge builder and supporting people to look at the best interests of children and how their lives may look if the adults surrounding them aren't in conflict, which reminds me a lot of the things that we've been talking about. The adults in our life who are in conflict. I do a number of other things related to forgiveness and reconciliation, and I'm also a life coach. So one of the things I wanted to close with circles back to your language of Ubuntu. And as simple as it sounds, the bravery and courage that comes into play for people to look each other in the eye and meet each other where they are. It seems to me that if we start there, that we have the opportunity to be in relationship. And as I sit here on this call, listening to the expertise of all of these incredible people on this panel, I think about those who might be wondering, how do I even start? How do I even be in relationship with someone? And I try and do that every single day. It's kind of hard these days because we're behind masks. And so we have to look at one another in the eyes or listen to the tone of the other's voice. And one of the things that I've noticed that is surprising to me, because we were talking about policing in the United States, and I shared this in conversation with all of you the other day, is I always look into the car of law enforcement when they're next to me at a traffic light. And I have the courage to smile at them. And I would say 99% of the time, that police officer looks at me like I'm absolutely nuts. Why are you looking at me? Why are you smiling at me? I'm authority. There's almost like, it feels like maybe it's my understanding is off. And then I go to this place of shame, which is silly, because I showed up trying to make a connection with a person irrespective of who they are. If we cannot even do that, I wonder how we will create equity in this world, in this community, in the city of Minneapolis, St. Paul. With that, I'm going to pass it back to you, Mr. Raj.
No, I appreciate, Louisa. I want to do a quick time check with the doc. How are we doing, doc?
We are doing very well. We are just
Okay.
coming to 60 minutes of our time.
Okay, and then we have a few more minutes for question answer. Is that?
Yes,
no?
I mean, we can just have our couple of in-house question and answers because we have just passed 60 minutes. Thank you.
Oh, I apologize and thank you. I want to real quickly bring this together in with what Louisa said, right? I mean, it is not an easy thing, right? We were never taught to build bridges in the way that will be organic, right? It is often staged. It is often at somebody else's expectation. So we have set up a lot of nonprofit foundations that gives you money, but there's always an expectation that you will give us the kind of results that we want, as opposed to you going out there and doing the work that you need to do. And we want to just simply share the resources and work and let you do your work, right? Often, so we have even created a nonprofit, for-profit industrial complex. And this industrial complex continues that work of white supremacist ideology in so many different ways, right? And it's much more ingrained in our system. And unless and until we are willing to peel those layers, we're not going to get to it and to undo, right? Even law enforcement in our country is often getting funding from all of these billionaires and for projects that they do. They in turn then turn around and say, look how great we are. We're going to give you free bikes. Why? Why would you do that? Come to the community and ask what we need. We'll tell you. Give us the resources. Trust us, right? So this industrial complex mentality continues to, so a lot of nonprofits have over the years built themselves up on the backs of oppression, on the backs of racism, right? And it is run by mostly white community members. So it is not easy to liberate us. And I wanna when we put the title Emancipation, I wanna just echo a few things before we hand it over and respond to the questions. I wanna say to emancipate, right? As the brother from Jamaica said, right? If we don't emancipate our own minds, right? That mental slavery as a result of colonization will continue to exert itself, right? And part of that emancipation is about how we understand how we are all, as Deandre said, cogs in this cycle. We need to stop. We need to go back to that indigenous practices of being mindful, breathe, right? Take a moment to see where we are and what stolen land we are standing on. If we don't recognize that we are standing on stolen land, right, we miss our opportunity to be mindful. And then ask the kinds of questions. How are our tax dollars being spent? Why are individuals in various countries being shot down by drones because they were suspected to be future terrorists or terrorists, right? While we never address homegrown terrorism that has been going on for years, right? We are coming upon the 100th anniversary of the destruction of a Black community that was thriving in Tulsa, Oklahoma, right? And again, we did not let people be emancipated. We dragged them through the process, right? Yanked the resources. So emancipation is about being mindful, right? And want to end by saying that let us stop focusing on public safety. Let us focus on public wellness. Appreciate it. Doc, it's all you.
Thank you very much. What a profound conclusion. Ladies and gentlemen, and dear audience, those who have listened to this whole episode and with us for last 62 minutes, to be precise, we thank you so very much that you have expressed interest with us. And I was monitoring the live counter at a given point in time. We had more than 34 viewers listening our whole discussion. Before I formally thank the panelists, I just would like to add some of the things that I was thinking when Dr. Raj, Regina, Louise, and Deandre they were talking about, and that kind of sort of a reflection I was thinking to share with the broader audience, because one of my students in my current course, I'm teaching peace education in Arthur V. Morrow Institute for Peace and Justice in this semester. It's a graduate level course. So I do touch the important historic figures in terms of peace and justice. So we do talk. We have a whole module on Dr. King. So one of my students in his presentation, thought paper presentation, he spoke about Brown versus Board of Education, May 17, 1954 verdict. So if some of you are aware, I'm just kind of recapping here. On May 17, 1954, the US Supreme Court delivered its verdict in Brown versus the Board of Education, ruling unanimously that racial segregation in public schools violated the 14th Amendment mandate of equal protection of the laws of the US Constitution to any person with its jurisdiction. Through the court ruling applied specifically to public schools, it implied that other segregated facilities were also constitutional. And specifically, Supreme Court Justice Earl Warren noted that, and I quote here, "Today, education is perhaps the most prominent function of state and local government. It is the very foundation of good citizenship. Such an opportunity is a right which must be made available to all on equal terms. We conclude that in the field of public education, the doctrine of separate but equal has no place. Separate educational facilities are inherently unequal," unquote. This is so profound for me to connect how much we actually progressed since 1954. I leave it to the opinion of the audience and our expert panelists today, just to ask this question maybe in the future, that what really stops us to achieving this disintegration in our schooling system. Ladies and gentlemen, while living in the Orwellian society of 1984, which I often quote in my school, in my courses and teaching, I do always keep thinking that how do we really negotiate structural conflict? As a student of peace and conflict studies, we often come across this theory of structural conflict. And you have heard all the panelists today talking about some of the profound themes. And let me summarize Dr. Raj's couple of key themes that he mentioned. He spoke about enforcement and the idea of enforcement through various tools and methods. He spoke about process of humanizing. He spoke about three very interesting ideas of restore, repair, and reform. He said that we study, but we don't engage. Then how do you expect things to change? Then Regina said conditional loyalty, and I love this idea that my existence is conditional. And especially the members of BIPOC community might be more understanding about this issue, that this is conditional. If you agree, then you are fine. If you do not agree, then you are out of this circle. Deandre spoke about his deeper experience in Haiti and the police raid. And these are so profound because it goes on as we speak in our society as well here. And of course, Louisa's story of Britain, her home country, always gives me an idea that the city of London, actually, if you are aware, every inch of the city of London is covered by CCTV. If you know, this is the most highly scrutinized city in the world as we speak. So, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to once again formally thank our enlightened speakers today. They have enlightened us with a lot of ideas. And it is us who have listened intensely. And people like me and our sponsor from the Rotary Club of Winnipeg Peace Builder Committee, we leave with these ideas to you to carry forward the idea so that you can emancipate yourself. You can enlighten your ideas. Thank you so much for being with us. And before I conclude, I would like to invite Gary Sempt from Rotary Club of Winnipeg to say the final words, and then we'll take off. Once again, ladies and gentlemen, dear audience, thank you so very much. Gary.
Thank you, Causa. I would start by thanking Dr. Causa and Min for providing the platform here. With our work at the Rotary Club, what we try to do is create a space to facilitate and inspire listening deeply. And so we've been listening here, and that's very powerful. Creating a safe space to do that is something that must be shared. Creating an ability to walk together. So as I listen to all of the speakers and their stories, you try to understand how can we walk better together. We're all on a journey in life, so we're all in a similar perspective that way. We share 99.9% of the DNA, regardless of our skin color or other attributes. So with that, how do we learn to celebrate those differences, that very small part of our DNA that makes us different? How do we celebrate that? How do we listen to the stories of others? How do we change our language so that we're really developing positive peace? And so for the educators on the phone, how do you teach people how to share belonging, create community, work together in that sort of a way? With institutions, one wonders if one changed the terminology a little bit. We think of police officers and we talked about enforcement and that type of thing. What if we went back to calling them peace officers and actually just made a little change in our terminology, but a big change in our thinking? So there's lots of opportunity here to share together, and I want to thank all of you for bringing to the audience and to us the great thoughts and deep reflections that you brought today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, dear audience. We appreciate your time. And once again, thank you, esteemed panelists, for being with us. Goodbye. Have a nice rest of the day.
Thank you.